Apollo's Angels, A History of Ballet by Jennifer Homans. Narrated by Kirsten Potter. Copyright 2010 by Jennifer Homans. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Jennifer Homans and the Wiley Agency, and was produced in the year 2011 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. For Tony. I am the necessary angel of earth, since, in my sight, you see the earth again. Wallace Stevens, Angel Surrounded by Pasons. A young Apollo, golden-haired, stands dreaming on the verge of strife, magnificently unprepared for the long littleness of life. Francis Cornford, Youth. Introduction, Masters and Traditions. I grew up in the intensely intellectual milieu of the University of Chicago, where both my parents worked. I'm not sure why my mother started me in dance, except that she liked to go to performances, and ballet perhaps also appealed to her Southerner's appreciation of etiquette and form. I was enrolled at a local ballet school run by an old couple who had danced with one of the Russian ballet troupes that toured America in the immediate post-war years. Theirs was not, however, your average dance school. There were no annual recitals or nutcrackers, no pink tutus with matching tights. He had multiple sclerosis and taught from a wheelchair, patiently, exasperatedly describing steps in intricate verbal detail as we tried, with his wife's help, to put them into movement. For him, ballet was something serious and urgent, even when it was also, and he communicated this too, a great joy. The teacher who set me on the path to the profession was a physics doctoral student at the University of Chicago who had himself once been a professional dancer. Ballet, he made me see, was a system of movement as rigorous and complex as any language. Like Latin or ancient Greek, it had rules, conjugations, declensions. Its laws, moreover, were not arbitrary. They corresponded to the laws of nature. Getting it right was not a matter of opinion or taste. Ballet was a hard science with demonstrable physical facts. It was also, and just as appealingly, full of emotions and the feelings that come with music and movement. It was blissfully mute, like reading. Above all, perhaps, there was the exhilarating sense of liberation that came when everything worked. If the coordination and musicality, muscular impulse and timing were exactly right, the body would take over. I could let go. But with dancing, letting go meant everything. Mind, body, soul. This is why I think so many dancers describe ballet, for all its rules and limits, as an escape from the self, being free. It was at George Balanchine's School of American Ballet in New York that I first began to glimpse the world that had made ballet what it was. Our teachers were Russians, exotic and glamorous ballerinas from another era. Filia Dubrovska, 1896 to 1981, had been born in Russia in the 19th century and had danced at the Mariinsky Theater in Imperial St. Petersburg in the years before the Russian Revolution. She later joined the Ballet Russe in Europe and eventually settled in New York City to teach, but we all knew that some part of her was still elsewhere, in a world far from ours. Everything about her was different. She wore heavy makeup, long, false eyelashes, and sickly sweet perfumes, and I remember her bejeweled and dressed in a deep royal blue leotard with matching scarf, chiffon skirt, and pink tights that showed off her unusually long and still impressively muscular legs. Her movements, even when she wasn't dancing, were gracious and ornamented, elegantly conveyed in ways that we American teenagers could never quite replicate. There were others, too. Muriel Stewart, an English dancer who had performed with the legendary Anna Pavlova, Antonina Tumkovsky and Hélène Dudin, who were both from Kiev and had emigrated to the States after the Second World War. Dudin's feet were crippled. It was rumored the Soviets had broken them. And perhaps most striking of all, Alexandra Danilova, who had fled Leningrad in 1924 with Balanchine. Danilova was like Dubrovska, a former imperial dancer inclined to pastel chiffons, spidery false eyelashes, and heavy perfume. She had been an orphan in Russia, but we never for a moment doubted her aristocratic pedigree. She coached us on carriage and comportment, not just in dance class, but also in life. No T-shirts, slumping, or street food, reminding us that our training and chosen profession set us apart. Dancers do not look like the rest. All of this seemed to me at once perfectly normal and extremely alien. Normal because we knew that these were the masters, and we understood that they had something important to convey. Besides, there was something about standing so straight, about the body working so beautifully, and about our dedication and intense desire to dance that did set us apart. We really were, or so we thought, an elect. But the whole thing was also alien. Nothing was ever really explained, and the teaching seemed offensively authoritarian. We were expected to imitate and absorb, and above all, to obey. Please to do was all the Russians could muster, and why was met with bemusement or flatly ignored. We were forbidden to study dance elsewhere, one of the few rules we blithely ignored. None of this sat well. We were children of the 1960s, and this insistence on authority, duty, and loyalty seemed outrageously old-fashioned and out of place. But I was too interested in what these Russians were doing to quit or go away. Finally, after years of study and watching, I realized our teachers were not just teaching steps or imparting technical knowledge. They were giving us their culture and their tradition. Why was not the point, and the steps were not just steps. They were living, breathing evidence of a lost, to us, past, of what their dances were like, but also of what they, as artists and people, believed in. Ballet, it seemed, was another world. I had queued with my mother to see the Bolshoi and the Kirov, stood squashed in standing room at the back of the Metropolitan Opera House to see American Ballet Theater and Baryshnikov, crowded into class to watch Rudolf Nureyev execute a ballet bar. And it was not just ballet. New York at the time was a dynamic center of dance, and we studied and saw everything. Martha Graham, Merce Cunningham, Paul Taylor, jazz, flamenco, tap, the small experimental troupes that performed in the city's studios and lofts. But to me there was one overriding reason to dance, the New York City Ballet. These were the final years of Balanchine's path-breaking career, and the artistic and intellectual vitality of his company was electrifying. We knew that what he was doing was important, and we never for a moment questioned the primacy of ballet. It was not old or classical or dated. To the contrary, dance was more intensely alive and present than anything we knew or could imagine. It filled our lives, and we analyzed its steps and styles and debated every rule and practice with almost religious zeal. In the ensuing years, as I joined the profession and danced with different companies and choreographers, I learned that the Russians were not the only ones. I worked and performed with Danes and with French and Italian dancers, tried the Cecchetti method, developed by an Italian ballet master, and attempted to unravel the intricacies of the syllabus set by Britain's Royal Academy of Dance. There were other Russians, too, Soviet dancers whose technique differed sharply from that of Dubrovska and the Tsar's former dancers. It was a curious situation. The language and technique of ballet appeared ideal and universal, yet these national schools were so utterly distinct. Americans trained by Balanchine, for example, raised their hip in arabesque and engaged in all manner of distortions to achieve speed and a long aerodynamic line. British dancers were horrified and considered these distortions in poor taste. They favored a more restrained, reserved style. The Danes had pristine footwork and quick, light jumps, achieved in part by dancing neatly toward the balls of the feet. But if you didn't put your heels down, you would never gain the soaring elevation and leaps that characterized the Soviets. The differences were not merely aesthetic. They felt different, and moving this way instead of that could make a dancer, for a moment, into a different kind of person. Swan Lake was a world apart from Agon. It was impossible to master all of these national variations, and as dancers we had to make choices. To further confuse matters, each school also had its heretics, dancers who had discovered some better way of organizing the body and had split off with their own coterie of followers. Whom you studied with, which master or sect you followed, determined who you were and what you wanted to become. Sorting through these debates, with their Jesuitical distinctions and knotty interpretive and personal dilemmas, was intensely absorbing and very physical. It was only later that I began to wonder how and why these national differences had come to be. Did they have a history? What was it? In those days, I never thought of ballet as anything but contemporary, a here-and-now art. Even the oldest of ballets are of necessity performed by young people and take on the look of their generation. Besides, unlike theater or music, ballet has no texts and no standardized notation, no scripts or scores, and only the most scattered written records. It is unconstrained by tradition and the past. Balanchine encouraged this idea. In countless interviews he explained that ballets are here and gone, like flowers or butterflies, and that dance is an ephemeral art of the present. Carpe diem, we might all be dead tomorrow. The point, he seemed to be saying, was not to bring back old musty dances such as Swan Lake. It was to make it new, Ezra Pound. For the dancers, however, this was a paradoxical injunction. History was all around us, in our teachers and the dances, but also in Balanchine's own ballets, many of which were suffused with memories and a romantic ethos. But we nonetheless made a cult of never looking back, of setting our sights resolutely on the present. And yet it is because ballet has no fixed texts, because it is an oral and physical tradition, a storytelling art passed on, like Homer's epics, from person to person, that it is more and not less rooted in the past. For it does have texts, even if these are not written down. Dancers are required to master steps and variations, rituals and practices. These may change or shift over time, but the process of learning, performing, and passing them on remains deeply conservative. When an older dancer shows a step or a variation to a younger dancer, the ethics of the profession mandate strict obedience and respect. Both parties rightly believe that a form of superior knowledge is passing between them. I never for a moment, for example, questioned the steps or style Danilova conveyed when she taught us variations from the Sleeping Beauty. We clung to her every movement. The teachings of the master are revered for their beauty and logic, but also because they are the only connection the younger dancer has to the past, and she knows it. It is these relationships, the bonds between master and student, that bridge the centuries and give ballet its foothold in the past. Ballet, then, is an art of memory, not history. No wonder dancers obsessively memorize everything: steps, gestures, combinations, variations, whole ballets. It is difficult to overstate this. Memory is central to the art, and dancers are trained, as the ballerina Natalia Marikova once put it, to eat dances, to ingest them and make them part of who they are. These are physical memories. When dancers know a dance, they know it in their muscles and bones. Recall is sensual, like Proust's Madeleines, and brings back not just the steps, but also the gestures and feel of the movement, the perfume, as Danilova said, of the dance, and the older dancer. Thus, ballet repertory is not recorded in books or libraries. It is held instead in the bodies of dancers. Most ballet companies even appoint special memorizers, dancers whose prodigious recall sets them apart from their peers, to store its works. They are ballet's scribes and pedants, and they keep whole oeuvres in their limbs, synchronized, usually, to music that triggers the muscles and helps to bring back the dance. But even dancers with superlative memories are mortal, and with each passing generation, ballet loses a piece of its past. As a result, the ballet repertory is notoriously thin. The classics are few, and the canon is small. We have only a handful of past ballets, most of which originated in 19th century France or late Imperial Russia. The rest are relatively new, 20th and 21st century works. There is some record, as we shall see, of 17th century court dances, but the notation system recording these dances died out in the 18th century and has never been fully replaced. These court dances are thus an isolated snapshot. The before and after are missing. The rest is spotty and full of holes. One might suppose that French ballet would be well preserved. The fundamental precepts of classical ballet were codified in 17th century France, and the art form has enjoyed an unbroken tradition there to the present day. But we have almost nothing. La Sylphide premiered in Paris in 1832, but that version was soon forgotten. The version we know today originated in Denmark in 1836. Similarly, Giselle was first performed in Paris in 1841, but the versions we know derive from the Russian production of 1884. Coppelia, from 1870, is in fact the only 19th century French ballet still widely performed in its, more or less, original form. As a consequence, most people think that ballet is Russian. It was in St. Petersburg that Marius Petipa, a French ballet master who worked at the imperial court from 1847 until just before his death in 1910, created La Bayadère in 1877, The Sleeping Beauty in 1890, and The Nutcracker and Swan Lake, both in collaboration with Lev Ivanov in 1892 and 1895 respectively. Mikhail Fokin's Les Sylphides, also widely performed today, was produced in St. Petersburg in 1907. The Mariinsky-trained Václav Nijinsky created L'après-midi d'une faune in Paris in 1912. George Balanchine was also born in St. Petersburg, and although many of his greatest ballets were made in Paris and New York, they drew on his Russian origins and training. The ballet canon, then, describes a tradition that is overwhelmingly Russian, and only really begins in the late 19th century. It would be as if the Western musical canon began with Tchaikovsky and ended with Stravinsky. But if ballet's repertory is thin, its standing in the history of Western culture is incontrovertible. It is a classical art. To be sure, the Greeks knew nothing of ballet, but like so much in Western culture and art, the origins of ballet lie in the Renaissance and the rediscovery of ancient texts. Ever since, dancers and ballet masters everywhere have seen ballet as a classicizing art and have sought to root it in the aesthetic values and prestige of 5th century Athens. Apollo holds a special place in the story. He is the god of civilization and healing, prophecy and music, not the noisy pipes and percussion of Pan and Dionysus, but the soothing and harmonious strains of the lyre, which set men's minds at ease. His noble physique and perfect proportions represent an ideal. He is moderation and beauty, man as the measure of all things. Apollo, moreover, is of high birth and a god among gods. He is the son of Zeus and the leader of the Muses, who matter too. Cultivated and beautiful women, they are the daughters of Zeus, and, not accidentally, of Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory. They represent poetry and the arts, music, pantomime, and dance, terpsichore. For dancers, moreover, Apollo is more than an ideal. He is a concrete physical presence, and they work daily, consciously or not, to remake themselves in his image, not only through imitation or the good fortune of natural endowment, but from the inside. All dancers carry in their mind's eye some Apollonian image or feeling of the grace, proportion, and ease they strive to achieve. And as any good dancer knows, it is not enough to assume Apollonian poses or appear as he does in art and statuary. For the positions to be truly convincing, the dancer must somehow become civilized. Physical problems are thus never merely mechanical, but have a moral dimension too. This is why dancers look so concentrated when they stand at the bar each morning and place their feet in first position. From Versailles to St. Petersburg, and well into the 20th century, the image of Apollo would tower over ballet. The ideas he represents lie at its core, and it is no accident that Apollo would be a constant theme and preoccupation of ballet masters everywhere. Indeed, his image frames our story. Renaissance princes and French kings liked to cast themselves in Apollo's image, often surrounded by the muses. In ballet after ballet, they portrayed him in plumes and gold, their own elevated stature and achievements reflected in his perfect physique and divine proportions. His image was thus imprinted on the art from its inception. At the other end, some 400 years later, George Balanchine created his own Apollon Musaget in interwar Paris. He would rework the ballet over and again to the very end. Dancers still perform Apollo today, and he continues to pull ballet back to its classical source. What of angels? Ballet has also always been of two worlds, the classical and the pagan Christian. It is inhabited by countless, weightless and insubstantial creatures, winged spirits, sprites, sylphs, and fairies, who dwell in the air, trees, and other natural realms. Like ballet itself, they are ephemeral and fleeting, the dream world of the Western imaginary. It is the wings that matter. The function of a wing, Socrates tells us, is to take what is heavy and raise it up into the region above, where the gods dwell. Of all things connected with the body, it has the greatest affinity with the divine. Among these airborne creatures, the angels are special. They are closest to God. Intermediaries and messengers, they are the link binding man and God, heaven and earth. For ballet, they are everything, a constant preoccupation and reference point that has expressed, in different ways at different times, the aspirations of the art. If Apollo is physical perfection, human civilization, and the arts, the angels are the dancer's desire to fly, but above all to ascend, to elevate themselves above the material world and toward God. But is classical ballet really just spirit and aspiration? Isn't it also, and much more obviously, an earthly art, sexual and erotic? Here, too, the angels are our best guide. They are not themselves sexual, but they can, and often do, inspire erotic feelings and desire. Dancers infrequently experience their art as sexual, even when their limbs are wrapped around each other or they are joined in impassioned embrace. Ballet is too unreal and contrived, pure artifice, and requires too much work and technical concentration to permit arousal. If anything, ballet is purifying, every movement physically honed and essential, with no superfluity or excess. It is a kind of grace. But if ballet is not inherently sexual, it is often highly sensual and erotic, the human body publicly revealed. If there is a tension here between physicality and spirit, earth and heaven, it is easily resolved. Even at its most risqué, ballet remains an idealized art. I wrote this history to answer the question that grew out of my life as a dancer, but I found I could not answer them from the vantage point of dance alone. Because the ballets themselves are elusive and ephemeral, and because ballet has no historical continuity, its story cannot be told in terms of itself. It has to be set in a larger context. But which context? Music? Literature? Art? Ballet has encompassed, in varying degrees at different times, all of these, and there are good arguments for approaching its history from each of these vantage points. What I have tried to avoid is rigid explanatory models, the materialist idea that art is shaped primarily, or exclusively, by economics, politics, and social relations, and the opposing idealistic view that the meaning of a work of art lies solely in its texts, that a dance should be understood in terms of its steps and formal requirements, without recourse to biography or history. I have resisted, too, the kind of thinking that assumes a dance does not exist until it is seen by an audience, that it is the reception rather than the creation of a work of art that determines its meaning. In this view, all art is unstable and changing. Its value depends entirely on who is seeing it, not on what the artist intended, consciously or otherwise, or on the kinds of vocabulary and ideas available to him at the time. This tyranny of the beholder seems to me unnecessarily rigid and anachronistic, part of our own contemporary fascination with instability and relative points of view. Even if we sympathize with the desire to say that all opinions are valid, the result is intellectually specious, critical evaluation reduced to mere opinion. I have thus tried to tell a story, but also to step back from the story and evaluate the dances. This can be difficult, since so many ballets have been lost. We cannot always point to this or that step or phrase to argue a point. But we must still try, in good faith and with open-minded attention to the evidence we do possess, to establish a critical point of view, to say that this ballet was better than that one, and why. Otherwise, our story would be nothing but a disaggregate of names, dates, and performances, not a story at all. In the end, what interested me most, and what drew me to ballet in the first place, was its forms. Why those steps performed that way? Who invented this artificial, archaic art, and what were the ideas animating it? What did it mean that the French danced one way and the Russians another? How had the art come to embody ideas, or a people, or a time? How did it become what it is today? I saw two ways to address these questions. The first was narrow and concentrated, stick close to the physical facts. I tried to get inside the art and to see it, whenever possible, from the dancer's point of view. The sources are notoriously thin, and the dances themselves mostly gone, but this should not deter us. Rich and informative accounts of antiquity and the Middle Ages have been written from far fewer sources and evoked a far more remote time. Even the smallest shards of evidence, the sequence of a ballet class written out in longhand, or a scribbled combination of steps, can cast light on the forms, ideas, and beliefs that animated the whole. Thus, at every stage of this book, I went back to the studio and tried to perform what we know of the dances. I did the steps myself, and watched them performed by others, in an attempt to analyze and understand what dancers thought they were doing and why. Ballet technique and its formal development are central to this story. Ballet may not have a continuous record, but this does not mean it does not have a history. To the contrary, people have been practicing and performing it for at least 400 years. Classical ballet grew up in Europe's courts. At its origins, it was an aristocratic etiquette and political event as much as it was an art. Indeed, perhaps more than any other performing art, the history of ballet is bound up with the fate of kings, courts, and states. What happened to the European aristocracy since the Renaissance also happened, in complicated ways, to ballet. The steps were never just the steps. They were a set of beliefs, echoing as they did the self-image of a noble caste. These larger connections, it seemed to me, were the key to an understanding of the art. How ballet began and what it became is best appreciated in light of the political and intellectual upheavals of the past 300 years. Ballet was shaped by the Renaissance and French classicism, by revolutions and Romanticism, by Expressionism and Bolshevism, modernism and the Cold War. It really is a larger story. It is also a story that may have come to an end. Today, ballet is widely seen as old-fashioned and out of date. It sits uneasily in our accelerated and disordered world. For those of us who were there at the end of the last great era and who experienced its vigor and its decline, the change has been momentous.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?